Okay, good.
Patrick, could you explain toxin sequestration theory to the viewer?
Yeah, thanks very much. So, toxin sequestration theory, or TST, is basically my theory for how does the body defend itself against toxins. And we all know that we're being inundated with toxins nowadays from every angle: environmental toxins, dietary toxins, and as well as just in our lifestyles. And so, furthermore, toxins appear to be driving practically every single disease. But what's fascinating is that the body doesn't just passively accept this, it doesn't just passively take toxins and all the damage that they cause. The body actually fights back. I believe our bodies are brilliant, amazing, and strategic, and they have very clever mechanisms in place to fight back against toxins. And a key strategy the body uses is to build extra tissue. And the idea is that the body doesn't build extra tissue for no reason. It's not just going to waste the amazing nutrition that we provided it for no good reason. It actually builds extra tissue largely for the purpose of storing and processing toxins, or keeping toxins away from the vital organs. And the most clear example of this is the case of a cancer tumor. And in other words, toxin sequestration theory is actually reinterpreting cancer tumors not as a selfish, malignant, uncontrolled growth, but rather as something that the body is building on purpose. It's viewing a cancer tumor as an intentional structure that the body is building in order to pull toxins away from the vital organs, protecting the vital organs from the damage that toxins would otherwise cause if the toxins were allowed to roam freely. So, and technically, this theory does go beyond cancer and even applies to things like fat tissue, obesity. More broadly, toxin sequestration theory argues that anytime the body is building extra tissue, whether it's fat tissue or cancer tumors or even skin growths like moles, lipomas, cysts, all of these correspond to the body building tissue to store toxins. And I think of it as like a hierarchical strategy. There is, I think, other people who have had similar ideas. There's a theory called homotoxicology, which has very similar ideas. But basically, at the lowest level of the hierarchy are the body's primary detox organs, which are the liver and the kidneys. And then also we can think of the body creating fat tissue as kind of a tier one strategy. So that's like the lowest tier. That's the body's first resort when exposed to toxins: are use the liver, use the kidneys, use the fat tissue to deal with toxins. And then when the toxic load increases further, the body will escalate to what I would call mini vaults. And mini vaults are the skin growths. So those are the lipomas, the moles, the cherry angiomas, the skin tags, the sebaceous cysts, and as well as some other phenomena that we see in, for example, the lungs. There's lung nodules. In the thyroid, there's thyroid nodules. All of those things are what I would call mini vaults. They're miniature storage vaults for toxins, and that's tier two. And then finally, when the toxic overload increases even further, the body escalates to a full-blown cancer tumor. And a cancer tumor represents basically the body's most sophisticated, most advanced toxin storage vault. And in fact, it's not just a storage vault, it's actually also a detox unit as well. It also acts to detoxify toxins. So some toxins can be detoxified, things like ethanol, drinking alcohol, and we can get into to that. But basically, there's certain toxins that can actually be detoxified. Other toxins, the body can just only store. Things like heavy metals, for example, those can only be stored. So, but in any case, a cancer tumor is tier 3, which is whenever the body is under extreme toxic overload. And that is the most advanced strategy the body has to deal with toxins. And so hopefully that kind of gives the bird's eye view on my theory of toxin sequestration theory. It's basically, how does the body defend itself against toxins? And we can dive deeper on each of those points. Yeah.
So, in terms of tumors dealing with toxins or the root cause of cancer being excess toxic burden, what is the best evidence that you found for this? Because obviously, when we're developing a theory or a hypothesis, trying to look at what's actually going on, and then putting the pieces together. So it starts with what's actually going on, and I'm sure you've encountered a lot of examples where the theory holds up.
Yeah. So I think of several arguments. The first argument, which is kind of intuitive, I think, is that whenever the body builds a tumor, it invests a lot of infrastructure, including new blood vessels. It's called angiogenesis, where the body builds new blood vessels to go to the tumor. And it also builds a mechanical scaffold that actually physically supports the tumor and holds it into place. So this is just sort of a logical argument that
a question about that, because that's really very, very interesting. So the way I've always thought about it is that angiogenesis, the creation of new blood vessels, is created from sort of inside the tumor, and that's sort of, people are saying that cancer is selfish, and so there obviously the blood vessel thing is being caused internally. Now, if the blood vessels are coming into the tumor externally, that would be a different story. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to figure out which is the right way to view it, of course. And so we would need some experiments to figure out how to differentiate between those two ideas. But my argument would be that it's, and like I said, it's not just the blood vessels, it's also the mechanical scaffold that holds it into place. And the idea is that, you know, I don't think of the cancer tumor as something that has a brain. It doesn't have a brain, right? So it's not an intelligent, sentient being. So it seems strange to me to think that the cancer tumor would act like as a central nervous system that is coordinating all this building and construction. Rather, the body does have a brain and does have a, you know, coordinating system. So my view, at least in my theory, is that it is the body that is coordinating all this construction, and that that the new blood vessels and the mechanical scaffold are built by the body. And from that angle, if we take that angle, now it makes sense that, you know, if the tumor really was the enemy, then why would the body invest so much infrastructure, new blood vessels, a mechanical scaffold to support the tumor? So, you know, but I think that you do bring up an interesting point, which is that how can we experimentally dive deeper on that and try to really differentiate between whether the growth is inside out or outside in? And I will think about that further. But in any case, that's sort of my first argument, which is that the body's investing tons of infrastructure. So if that was the case, why would the tumor be the enemy? The second argument is that there is a lot of medical literature showing that toxins accumulate at very high levels inside of cancer tumors relative to normal tissue. And there's a long list. So a good example would be microplastics. They found microplastics, which are known toxins. They do cause tissue damage. And in this theory, basically, I define a toxin as anything that damages the body's tissues and organs. So that's how we define what a toxin is. And microplastics do fit that bill. And they've been found in high concentrations in many different tumor tissues relative to normal tissue. A second example would be forever chemicals. These are found in the nonstick pans, things like Teflon. And those have also been found in high concentrations. These are industrial chemicals, right? They're known toxins, and they go by the name of PFAS. And those are found in high concentrations inside of cancer cells relative to normal tissue. A third example would be seed oils. So these are things like, canola oil, soybean oil, etc. And there's a chemical in there called linoleic acid, and that's kind of the toxin that creates oxidative damage. It causes lipid peroxidation, and that chemical, linoleic acid, which is the toxic chemical in seed oils, has been found in very high concentrations in many different cancer tumors, especially prostate cancer. So, and then the list kind of goes on and on. There's a plant toxin called oxalate. Oxalate is found in spinach, and it's known to be a key cause of kidney stones. And that has been found in very high levels inside of breast tumors. So, but there was a study called Oxalates-Induced Breast Cancer, and that study looked inside of breast tumor tissue as well as normal breast tissue, and they found that oxalates accumulate oftentimes 10 times higher in concentration inside of breast tumor tissue relative to normal breast tissue. And this was a repeated study where they analyzed multiple breast tumor samples, and they found that every single sample that they looked at had higher levels of oxalate than normal breast tissue. The same pattern we see for heavy metals, things like mercury, cadmium, lead, arsenic. All of those have been found in high concentrations inside of cancer cells. So those are just some examples. And there's probably some that I'm leaving off. I left off aluminum. Aluminum is another metal that accumulates. It's well known that, or it's been shown that aluminum accumulates in high levels inside of breast tumor tissue. So anyway, those are some examples that are in the medical literature where they have just found it at higher levels inside of tumor tissue relative to normal tissue. Now, you might point out that, oh, what if those toxins just got in by accident? And or what if, or an alternative theory would be like, oh, what if the cancer cell is using those toxins for some purpose? So those are two different kind of counter arguments to my theory, which would say like, oh, maybe the toxins just got in there by accident. And the second counter argument would be like, oh, maybe the tumor is using the toxins for some nefarious purpose, like to grow bigger or something. Let me address the latter point first, which is that when you look at what the tumor is actually doing with these toxins, it's actually not using them for any biological purpose. It's actually literally just storing them. So in the case of the microplastics, it just stores the microplastics in the lysosomes inside the cancer cells, just stores them for safekeeping. In the case of the seed oils and the forever chemicals, it stores them in lipid droplets. So these are basically balls of lipids that are just floating around in the cytoplasm of cancer cells. They're not serving any biological purpose. They're just floating around. And these lipid droplets, by the way, are super high in cancer tumor tissue. For example, they looked at normal brain tissue versus brain tumor tissue. There are no lipid droplets floating around inside of brain tissue, normal tissue. But in brain tumor tissue, they are packed full of these lipid droplets. So anyway, they're just storing the seed oils and the forever chemicals in these balls of lipids. And then similarly, the same is true for some of the toxic metals. There's certain toxic metals that they just store in like balls, like metal balls, and then they wrap them in like a protein shell. So that's sort of my pushback against the argument that they're actually using the toxins for some purpose. In practice, what we see is that they're just storing the toxins. They're not actually using them. But maybe the biggest interesting point is, do the toxins get in by accident? Because there is a theory, which is that the toxins may just get into a normal cell by accident. And then once they're inside, they could cause damage to the cell, damage to the mitochondria, damage to the DNA, and that could trigger some downstream process that would make the cancer turn selfish and malignant. But once again, it looks like that is not what the literature is saying. What the literature is saying is that the cancer cells intentionally, purposefully pull in the toxins. by upregulating their transport processes. So in the case of seed oils, they dramatically upregulate the specific fatty acid transporters needed on their cell surface to pull linoleic acid in out of the body fluids. So they have tons of these fatty acid transporters on their cell surface, especially in things like prostate cancer. And that's pulling in the seed oils out of the body fluids to sequester them. And the same is true for some of these toxic metals as well. They can upregulate some transporters on their cell surface to pull in these toxic metals. And in the case of microplastics, as you can imagine, there's no transporter specific for microplastics, but instead what they do is upregulate a process called endocytosis. And that is basically the cancer cells drinking the extracellular fluid. So cancer cells do more of this drinking than normal cells do. So they suck up the microplastics out of the extracellular fluids, and they do more of that than normal cells do. Okay, so that's basically my arguments in a nutshell for this theory. So just to recap, I gave sort of 4 arguments. I think one was the idea that the body invests infrastructure to the cancer tumor. Number 2 is that there's multiple studies showing that cancer cells have high levels of the toxins. And then number 3 is that the cancer cells aren't using the toxins for any purpose, they're just storing them. And then finally, number 4, they upregulate their transport processes to actively pull in the toxins.
Yeah, what's beautiful here is that this doesn't only explain cancer, it explains cancer cells, because what I've heard, at least what I learned in school, is that everybody has a degree or a level of, I should say, amount of cancer cells in them. And so, okay, maybe those aren't bad and they're actually doing something important, and you should strive to have maybe a Goldilocks zone of cancer cells at all times. Interesting. Now, the question I have is, clearly if the cause of cancer, the root cause of cancer is toxins, then when we look at cancer remissions, probably the more alternative health ones, we should see that detoxification is central in that process. Now, I'm guessing you have looked at some of these cases. Would you say that this is a central theme in the methods they use that have been beneficial, or in general, when it comes to things that aren't traditional cancer treatment, are they usually, maybe also in the medical field, do they also pertain to detoxification in most cases?
That's a great question. And I do like to classify cancer treatments into 2 main categories. Roughly speaking, there's treatments that attack the tumor, and there's treatments that lower the level of toxins that the body is exposed to. So I want to separate those 2 types of treatments. The mainstream cancer treatments are in the category of attacking the tumor. They're in the category where they, things like radiation therapy and chemotherapy, these are things that directly attack the tumor and try to kill the cancer cells. And then there's another type, a completely different, very opposite type of approach, which is treatments that just try to lower the toxic burden on the body, right? Which is sort of what you were getting at, the sort of detoxification ideas. And from my theory's perspective, the detoxification approach, like lowering the toxic burden, that is the appropriate, correct way to try to deal with cancer. And that means lowering your dietary toxins, lowering your environmental toxins, reducing toxins in your lifestyle, reducing stress. And there is a phenomenon that's called spontaneous tumor regression, or STR, and it is documented in the medical literature. There are papers on this. And STR corresponds to the case where patients were given a cancer diagnosis, but then they abstained from conventional medical treatment. So they opted out of the chemotherapy and the radiation, et cetera. And instead, what those patients did is that they changed their diet and their lifestyle and their environment to reduce their toxic burden. So they got on better diets, better lifestyles, better environments, and they reduced their intake of toxins. And there's hundreds of case studies of those types of patients who witnessed tumor regression, which means that over time their tumors shrank in size and potentially fully disappeared over time. So this is documented in the literature, and of course, the mainstream medicine has a hard time explaining these cases. They have a hard time explaining how this could be true. They sort of view it as some kind of miracle, like an idiopathic miracle that can't really be explained. But from the perspective of my theory, toxin sequestration theory, we can understand it very simply. The idea is that the body builds a tumor on purpose to be as like a backup detox organ. It's basically a storage vault for toxins. And whenever the toxic burden has been decreased, then the body says, oh, well, I don't need that anymore. I don't need to invest all these resources into this detox organ, so I can decommission my backup detox organ now. So it decides to basically decommission it and basically remove the structure. So it basically removes the upstream need, which is the toxic burden, for the structure itself. So that's basically documented in the medical literature, and that's the kind of treatment that would be consistent with my theory. The converse, of course, is the mainstream treatments, and those are the treatments that would be sort of against my theory. So those are things like chemotherapy, radiation, etc. And the basic idea of those theories are that cancer cells are vulnerable because they're storing toxins, so they're packed full of toxins. And because they are full of toxins, they're in this precarious situation where if you just add more toxins to the mix, you can push them over the edge and they will die. And those cancer cells will basically apoptosis and die. And that's the idea behind chemotherapy and radiation therapy, which is that they're adding more toxicity to the mix, and that basically kills the cancer cells. Now, the problem with that approach, as you can imagine, is that number one, the chemotherapy, for example, is directly toxic to the body, so that can damage the body's tissues. But then indirectly, it actually releases toxins back into the body by bursting open the cancer cells. And those cancer cells were already full of microplastics and forever chemicals and seed oils and oxalates and heavy metals. And now they just released all that back into the body fluids. And this is often why we see rebound cancers when people are treated with chemotherapy, because now the body is scrambling. It has these toxins floating around, and it's like, now I have to build a new tumor in order to sequester and store all these toxins that were released back into the body. And that's why it's very common to see rebound cancers in cases where people use conventional medical treatment. Yeah. So hopefully that summarizes that view. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So the next very important question is to discuss carcinogens that don't relate to toxins. Obviously, radiation would be one of these. Then also, mostly when we speak about radiation, we're talking about ionizing radiation. I am of the perspective that non-ionizing radiation is also a problem, and that increases the risk of cancer as well. And then let's discuss that first, and then we could go into perhaps DDW, which seems to also help with cancer survival, more specifically, if we're very scientifically accurate. And that doesn't seem to be necessarily toxin related, but it seems to help. So I would love to get your perspective on, well, let's begin with the radiation.
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever I was approaching this toxin theory, I was curious whether there was some kind of unifying feature behind how do we define what a toxin is. And I mentioned that at a high level, we think of a toxin as anything that damages the body's tissues and organs. But then we can dive deeper and say, well, what is the molecular mechanism of that? How does a toxin damage the body's tissues and organs? What does it do? And whenever we look at things like microplastics, seed oils, forever chemicals, oxalates, heavy metals, interestingly, there's like a unified way in which they all create damage, and that is through oxidation. And so just as how, like if we were to hold our hand over a flame, that flame would damage the skin cells by oxidizing our skin cells, right? Oxidizing things. And that's what burning means. Similarly, your body can burn from the inside out. And that is sometimes called oxidative stress, or more precisely, it's oxidative damage. And that occurs because toxins will create these free radicals that are called reactive oxygen species, or ROS. ROS is reactive oxygen species. Those are small oxygen-containing molecules. They're very small. They only have a couple atoms per molecule, but they're highly reactive typically because they may have like a free radical on them, and they basically just react with everything in their path, and then they just oxidize our biomolecules. So they'll basically hit the nearest biomolecule, so they'll bump into a protein or a DNA molecule or a lipid, and then they'll just oxidize it. And that looks like the underlying molecular mechanism by which every toxin manifests its toxicity, is by creating these ROS chemicals, which then go off and damage biomolecules. And then you're left with dead tissue, basically damaged tissue. So now, getting to radiation, what's fascinating is that radiation does the exact same thing as the chemical toxins. So starting first with X-ray radiation, which is ionizing radiation, that actually rips apart water molecules. So if you have H2O, what X-rays will do is that they'll rip off a hydrogen and produce the OH radical, the hydroxyl radical. And that's an ROS. That's actually literally a reactive oxygen species. So X-ray radiation directly creates these ROS chemicals, which then go off and damage biomolecules. And so that's like a pretty obvious case. In the case of EMF, like microwaves or radio frequencies from cell phones, Wi-Fi, etc., that's non-ionizing, but nevertheless, apparently they still do produce ROS by a different mechanism. And, they disrupt mitochondria, and they also mess with voltage-gated calcium channels. And I guess there's more than one way in which they can create ROS, but nevertheless, they do end up creating these same ROS chemicals as the X-rays do. And so that can explain why both X-ray radiation and EMF, radio frequencies, can also, both of those can cause tissue damage. Both of those can damage the body's organs and drive disease, right? And so now you might say, well, but how do we think about it from the cancer side? How do we think about it from the perspective of a cancer tumor? Why would these guys, these radiation, X-rays and EMF, drive cancer? And that suggests that maybe the underlying driving force for cancer is not necessarily toxins, but rather the oxidative damage that the toxins create. And so then we can see that the purpose of the cancer tumor looks basically to mitigate oxidative damage, because there's a broader idea that oxidative damage appears to be at the center of every single disease: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism, heart disease, kidney disease, etc. All of these are tissue damaging diseases where the body is under oxidative stress. So the body doesn't want those diseases, and that means that the body is constantly always watching to see how much oxidative stress is it under. And it has sensing mechanisms. There are actually like biochemical sensors, things like glutathione, and there's some pathway, I'll just mention the name, NRF2, that actually is a sensing mechanism for how much oxidative stress the body is under locally. And so if the body is like constantly checking, like how many ROS chemicals are there in this region of the body and in this region of the body, then you can imagine that if X-rays come in or EMF comes in and then creates a big burst of ROS chemicals in some region of the body, then that triggers the sensor, and the body flips the switch and it's like, okay, shoot, I need to build a tumor now. I've got tons of oxidative stress and oxidative damage in this region of the body. And then the tumor will help to sequester not only the chemical toxins creating the oxidative damage, but also the oxidative damage caused by the radiation. That's the rough idea. And I'm still fleshing this out. I don't want to necessarily present this as something that I've like 100% nailed down mechanistically, but nevertheless, that is my broader theory, which is that the ultimate trigger for when the body decides to build a tumor is what are the local levels of ROS in a given tissue, the local amounts of oxidative stress that a given tissue is under. I think that is what the body is sensing, and that is what triggers the formation of a tumor. And then the tumor's job is to sequester both the chemical toxins that are creating the oxidative stress, as well as all the damaged biomolecules that have occurred from radiation as well. Yeah, so that's my view on radiation and why. And I guess what I'm trying to paint the picture is that radiation is ironically not that much different from the chemical toxins. They both have the same underlying mechanism.
So my question there would be, in your model, maybe you went over it and I missed it. How would the tumor then sequester ROS? Because the mechanism that I would think of then is that in the tissue, clearly the oxidative damage, for the most part, unless you have active radiation going on, will be due to mitochondria that are just not working well. That's mainly where we produce free radicals. And so I can imagine that a tumor would form there and actually take in all these damaged mitochondria and make sure that they're not damaging the tissue itself, that you create a ball there where these mitochondria can be dysfunctional and not damage the rest of the body. That's the mechanism I can see. And then in terms of explaining why the tumor would show up in one place when the radiation is hitting the whole body, well, maybe that's because you don't have the same mitochondrial capacity everywhere, and you don't have the same kind of how do we say health of mitochondria everywhere. So then if you're getting radiation everywhere, well, the tumor will appear in the weakest link. What do you think of that?
The tumor will appear in the weakest link. That makes sense to me. Yes, I like that statement. And yeah, the tumor will appear in the place where there's sort of the most oxidative damage, the most numbers of toxins, et cetera. And yeah, I like that. And I think that, ROS, as you can imagine, are highly reactive and they will very quickly react with everything. So I don't want to say that the cancer tumor is sequestering the ROS, because I think whenever the ROS is created locally, they'll just immediately damage stuff. What I think the tumor is sequestering in the case of radiation are the damaged biomolecules. I think they're sequestering the molecules that got burnt, basically, the damaged ones, including damaged lipids, damaged proteins, DNA, and damaged mitochondria, as you said. So that's my belief there, is that, and in a lot of these molecules, by the way, once they're damaged, they become sort of toxic in themselves, in a sense. So it's well known, for example, that like a glycated protein is a damaged protein, right? But that's an AGE, and an AGE is actually toxic in itself. So like when you damage a protein, either by glycation or by oxidizing it or something, that molecule can become toxic in itself. Same is true for lipids. Like people talk about damaged lipids, right? So damaged PUFAs or something. So those can be toxic. So I don't think the cancer tumor is trying to sequester the ROS. I think it's trying to sequester the results of the ROS damage, the damaged biomolecules. Yeah. But make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah, that
Yeah.
it's not sequestering the source of the ROS, but it is sequestering the thing that's been burnt.
Yeah, exactly.
Not sequestering the fire, but the damaged building.
Right, exactly.
This brings up a question. It seems to me like both, again, the mechanism that you're narrowing it down to mostly is oxidative damage, that things are being damaged both by toxins or radiation or whatever it may be. And what you're describing, obviously, none of it is wrong. But what I'm thinking is, how about like with the theory, the theory is toxin sequestration theory. How about, is there a reason why, I should ask, why you didn't name it, um, say, oxidative damage prevention theory or something like that? Because
That's
it
a
seems to
yeah.
encompass more.
That's a really good point. And I sort of agree with you. It's just that the majority of the things that do create the oxidative damage are chemical toxins. Nevertheless, I agree that it does the sort of, whenever we get into the physical stressors, the X-rays, the EMF, then it's, we don't usually think of them as toxins. So but I do think that there might be an opportunity to use a broader name in the future. And I'll point out that I'm not the first person to come up with this idea that all toxins produce oxidative damage. There is a doctor, his name is Thomas Levy, 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 and he wrote a book called The Only Cause of Disease. And in that book, he identifies the oxidative damage from toxins as the only cause of disease. And so I'm actually building on his work. I discovered this independently from him, but nevertheless, he wrote a whole book on it. So he's an expert on this. And so he sort of agrees with me that this is the primary cause of disease. And so you can see how I'm kind of making two columns. Like I have a column of things that are actually diseases: autism, heart disease, kidney disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS. Those are real tissue damaging diseases where the oxidative damage is, destroying the body's organs. And then I have another column over here of defense mechanisms. That's the cancer, the obesity, the skin growths, the cysts. Those are the things where the body is building extra tissue. And so it's like over on this side, the defense mechanisms are actually preventing the diseases. So they're protecting the body from the oxidative damage and protecting you against these actual real diseases. But nevertheless, I appreciate your suggestion. It's a good point. And I largely agree with you, actually, that if we want to be more precise, we would actually say oxidative damage prevention. And yeah, I was a little bit imprecise, and because this does go beyond toxins.
Yeah, oxidative damage sequestration. I must say, like when it comes to agreement, yes, I agree with this as well. Because if one, say, subscribes to the well, if one understands that most chronic diseases have a huge mitochondrial component, bioenergetic component to them as well, well then anything that's going to cause oxidative damage, toxins or electromagnetism, is clearly going to be implicated there. But so let's see here.
Yeah. You wanted to get back to deuterium,
To
right?
DDW.
Yeah.
To DDW. And
Yeah.
yeah, just tell me what do you think is, how would you explain the let's say cancer survival increase using DDW through toxin sequestration theory?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the audience, deuterium is basically heavy hydrogen. It's the hydrogen atom with an extra neutron. It's an isotope of hydrogen, and it's found naturally occurring in water. So if you go out to a river or a stream, you're going to find deuterium at a concentration around like 150 parts per million. Interestingly, our bodies seem to prefer deuterium at a slightly lower concentration. So it seems to prefer deuterium around like 120 parts per million, roughly speaking. And our bodies do make our own water as well. It's called metabolic water. And typically that water has the lower concentration of deuterium. So it is slightly deuterium depleted. And now I will highlight the fact that Stephanie Seneff, who's an MIT professor, or actually MIT senior researcher, she really has written several papers about deuterium and its connection to cancer. And she's really laid out this sort of toxin sequestration view for the case of deuterium. And, what she has argued is that deuterium can fit in the same paradigm as being viewed as a toxin. Now, it does create these ROS chemicals. It does create oxidative damage. The mechanism by which it creates those ROS is interesting, and it does go via the mitochondria. So it happens in the mitochondria, and it basically stutters the motor that is involved in producing ATP, and it sort of disrupts that motor. And that motor typically relies on the flow of hydrogen ions. But if you put in a whole bunch of deuterium ions instead of hydrogen ions, then that motor will kind of get stuttered and interrupted. And then anyway, that by interrupting that motor or disrupting it, it does produce these ROS chemicals. So that's basically how deuterium produces ROS. But we could also be agnostic and say, well, it doesn't matter how it produces ROS, it does produce ROS. And so anything that produces ROS, technically speaking, is classified as a toxin in this theory. And so that means that I would be viewing deuterium on the exact same footing as heavy metals, seed oils, forever chemicals, microplastics, etc. I would be viewing it as just yet another toxin that fits into this theory. And I will point out that when I came at this theory, I was building on the work of Stephanie Seneff. So she laid out how deuterium is sequestered and stored by cancer cells in dramatic detail in her research. And she was the one who inspired me in the first place to look at this idea of toxin sequestration theory. And what she showed is that the cancer cells don't just passively get deuterium, they actually actively get it. They send their proton pumps to their cellular membrane, and they actually pump out protons, which are just literally pure protons, so not deuterium. And that the net effect is that if they're always pumping out protons to the extracellular space, is that they're leaving behind deuterium enriched water, deuterium in a deuterium enriched environment, right? So they're basically accepting the fact that they're going to act as deuterium storage vaults, and they're shooting out good, beneficial protons to their surroundings. And if that wasn't crazy enough, they also actively send out lactate, which is an important nutrient that is deuterium depleted to their surroundings. So it's actually like the lactate that they send out to their surroundings is low in deuterium. So they're sending out low deuterium stuff to the surroundings, doing a service to the body. And then they're keeping inside the deuterium enriched stuff. So I find that very fascinating. And that was the thing, when I heard that from Stephanie Seneff, I was like, whoa, I was mind blown when I heard that. And so what that is saying is that cancer cells are hoarding deuterium just like they hoard seed oils, microplastics, forever chemicals, and it fits the story quite well. Now, how does that get into DDW? Well, that's deuterium depleted water. And it's well known that when people do drink deuterium depleted water, it tends to increase survival time, like lengthen the lifespan of people who have cancer. I mean, sometimes by multiple factors, like 3x or 4x, it can extend the lifetime of people many times longer. And that basically highlights the fact that, well, it's a toxin. So it would kind of be, I think of DDW as kind of like, filtering the toxins out of your water. Imagine like using a water filter versus not using a water filter. The people that are using a water filter have filtered out the microplastics, the forever chemicals, the heavy metals, right? So those people would probably live longer than the people who aren't filtering the water, the people who are drinking the microplastics and the forever chemicals and the heavy metals. So that's how I view DDW, is it's kind of like filtered water. It's highly filtered. It's removed the toxins, and so they're getting exposed to less toxins. And it also highlights the fact that deuterium almost certainly is not just connected to cancer, but it's almost certainly connected to all these other diseases that I mentioned. Things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism, uh, heart disease, kidney disease. I would bet money that deuterium is connected to those real diseases, and that cancer is trying to prevent deuterium's impact on those diseases. So anyway, that's my view on deuterium and deuterium depleted water. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Now, the last thing is what we've discussed off camera, which I only mention because I find it fascinating, and I'd like the viewer to know it as well. Basically, in the book Light and Shaping Life by Roland van Wyk, he mentions that when you implant embryos into, let's say, a frog, so a frog embryo that's growing into a frog, the frog gets quick malignant cancer and dies. Now, if you do the same thing with salamanders, they also die. But with salamanders, they famously regenerate their limbs. They have an ability that I believe we only have in our fingertips right now, currently in our current state. If you implant the tumor there, let's say in the tail, and then you cut right in the middle of the tail where the tumor is, in the middle of the tumor. So half the tumor is or not the sorry, half the embryo slash that has become a tumor is left there, and it's and right in that area you have the regeneration effect. It commences. You actually the salamander doesn't get malignant cancer. So what I would be really interested in is to see sort of how toxin sequestration theory would explain these things, because to me, I'm always like, obviously I mentioned it to you because I wanted to sort of, the more holes someone could let's say fix in their theory, the stronger it becomes.
Yes.
So obviously if one puts that whole thing to work, then the theory becomes even stronger, which is sort of what I'm looking for. But so
Yeah,
this is
that's great.
something that came to mind that I remembered having read a large portion of the book.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's great. Once again, think of cancer tumors as kind of tier 3 on a tiered hierarchy, where tier 1 are kind of like the standard detox approaches: liver, kidneys, fat tissue, even sweating would be viewed as tier 1. Tier 2 are the mini growths, skin growths, for example, and tier 3 are the tumors. So cancer tumors are kind of like an advanced strategy, but there's all these other strategies as well to sequester toxins and hoard toxins, store toxins, keep them away from the vital organs. So you mentioned this regeneration of the tail, which is really interesting. And I wonder if the regeneration itself, well, of course, it is the salamander building extra tissue. I wonder if that regeneration is somehow sequestering toxins. Is there any, well, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there any way that that could be true? Like, could the regeneration of the tail be somehow sequestering toxins? I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just speculating. But yeah, so that's like one idea, is that the body is building extra tissue in the form of regenerating the tail. And you mentioned that that somehow prevents the cancer tumor from happening. So that would be interesting, because it would suggest that, well, maybe the body has found a different strategy, like using the tail to somehow store the toxins, as opposed to using the more advanced strategy, which is the tumor. So that's one thought there. The embryo one, it's not obvious for me how to explain it. I assume when you say embryo, was that a frog embryo that they put in?
Pretty
So they put a frog embryo into a frog.
yes, they
Okay.
transplanted that growing embryo into the frog.
Okay. That's and they just put it into some random tissue or something. They put a growing
Very,
embryo.
very sure. The details are, of course, in the book. I mean,
Okay.
I could grab it, but
Yeah, no, that's fine. That is very interesting. So what is going on here? Well, as we can imagine, the growing embryo could create a lot of physical stress on the local tissues. And mechanical stress is actually technically a toxin. So I'll give an example of mechanical stress. So when you hook up a patient to a ventilator, the ventilator mechanically expands the lungs. It stresses the lungs. It actually mechanically expands the lungs. And that creates ROS. Like whenever you hook up a patient to a ventilator, this was used widely in the pandemic, that creates tons of ROS in the body, and it's a mechanical stress. So mechanically stressing the body can create ROS. So I have to wonder whether like putting in just like a growing embryo mechanically stresses out the local environment, and that is a source of stress. And even this goes beyond. There's a lot of people who talk about the role of like emotional trauma in cancer, and emotional stress as well does create oxidative stress. So emotional stress does create these ROS chemicals, and can increase the risk of getting a cancer tumor and other issues as well. So so more broadly, you could say that there's kind of like a stress-based theory where toxins provide oxidative stress, mechanical things provide oxidative stress, and emotional things. So as well as the radiation. But I will admit that I'm going to have to dive deeper on that embryo idea, because that's like I'm just speculating at this point, that maybe the growing embryo is just like mechanically stressing things locally.
Well,
Yeah.
what's interesting is that, and I think one of the reasons why these scientists did this is because what you see with a tumor is that one hallmark is that it's hypoxic. And you also see that with the embryo is also hypoxic. And what has been identified is that for growth to take place, you need hypoxia. So what's actually happening is that the embryo itself is becoming a tumor. And they're sort of comparing that the same hypoxic state, the same, you could almost say, biochemistry, is in both of these different growth cases is the same. Roland is, of course, his point is that the light signal that each cell emits informs shape itself. Like why there's nowhere in the genes that determines that the hand is supposed to look like this. It doesn't really know that. He's saying that what gives shape to life is this light signal, and the difference between the embryo and the tumor is that, of course, this goes against your theory, but that the tumor has lost its light signal, and so it doesn't know how to shape itself in relation to the rest of the organism, while with an embryo, its light signal is, you could almost say, coherent, so it knows which shape to take, and thus it becomes an organism. And then when you put the embryo inside of another organism, I mean, obviously you get issues, and so the light signal becomes not coherent and then grows into a tumor. So this I think if you look into this more, I think it would be really, really, really interesting. And also that book in general, because a large portion of it deals with cancer.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestion. I will definitely look into that. And I just wanted to point out that there are a lot of toxins that we didn't talk about that are traditionally associated with cancer. Things like cigarette smoke and asbestos and drinking alcohol. And I have found literature showing that the same ideas that I've outlined for microplastics, et cetera, also apply to these other chemicals that cancer cells try to hoard them and detoxify them. So I think it's good. What I try to do is that I try to basically find, okay, where is the underlying source of oxidative stress? And I'll just try to figure that out with the embryo. Also we've been given this kind of language, right? We've been given the language that cancer tumors are either malignant or benign. And I feel like a lot of times the language itself is the problem, and it's kind of misdirecting our thinking. And in my theory, one of the most common questions I get is like, why do people die of cancer if cancer is protective, right? And my theory would actually question the very labeling of the cause of death in cancer. And I actually do not believe that cancer tumors are necessarily killing people in most cases. I believe the primary cause of death in cancer patients is actually toxic overload. Because my broader theory is that my broader theory is that toxins are the root cause of every disease, and they damage the body's organs. And cancer is a symptom of toxic overload. So anyone who has cancer is in a very precarious situation where they have toxic overload. And if you give those patients even more toxins, which is what chemotherapy and radiation therapy are, then you can push that patient over the edge and bring them closer towards mortality. Unfortunately, it's very tragic. But anyway, I just wanted to give the full picture for the audience that might be wondering, why is it that people still die of cancer if it's protective? I'm actually saying they're not dying of the tumor, but they're dying of toxic overload. Yeah, so that's my belief. So anyway, but I will look into that. I appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you.
Because also I'll add one more. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah. I'll add one more thing to that, and then you may, because I will have finished my list of questions. So if you'd like to sort of add anything else, that would be wonderful. Well, the interesting thing is that for light to be created in the human body, which again it seems to be an essential component of the way the body functions for signaling. We have a lot of optical signaling going on. You actually need oxygen. So this oxygen creates the free radicals, and obviously you can't. We need some free radicals for things like mitophagy, for cell signaling, etc. That's why you have NRF2, for example. You need the free radical signal to eliminate bad mitochondria, for example. But it is this ROS that creates the light, right? So you can see that if you maybe because we're putting it. I think what the book would posit is this. Obviously, we said that all the toxins create oxidative damage. Could it be that this oxidative damage on top of that messes up the light signal, for example? So then you would have also, together with the things burning down, another biophysical informational signal on top of that, or part of the theory, which would be really interesting. But no, I'm very excited. Like, if you delve into that book, I'd be very excited to know sort of what your thoughts are, because obviously every book is filtered through each mind differently. so that's something.
Yeah, I will. I really appreciate that suggestion. I'll look into it. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, my friend?
I just want to say, yeah, this has been a great conversation. I appreciate it. And, the broader message of my theory is almost philosophical, but it's basically just saying that the body is not broken. It's actually brilliant, amazing, and strategic. Mainstream medicine wants to convince us that our bodies are faulty, we have bad genetics, our bodies attack itself all the time with autoimmune conditions, and our tissue is malignant. But what we're trying to do here is flip the script and say, what if our bodies are actually brilliant, amazing, and strategic, and they know what they're doing? And my theory is basically providing kind of like the biochemical version of that philosophical idea. Yeah.
Thank you for your word, Patrick.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks very much. It was really good talking to you.
Likewise.